Boxing coach Mason Reed thought Abigail Carter was just a tired single mother who wandered into the wrong building. In front of dozens of fighters under the fluorescent lights of his Chicago gym, he laughed, threw a pair of scuffed gloves onto the mat, and dared her to survive one round with him. Nobody knew Abigail had vanished from the fighting world after a tragedy she had buried for years. She said nothing. She simply pulled her hair back and looked at Mason with eyes gone cold. Then she threw one punch. When his body hit the canvas, the whole gym went silent. Abigail Carter walked into the old boxing gym in downtown Chicago on a gray Tuesday morning, her coat too thin for the wind that had followed her the whole way there. She was not looking for a fight. She was looking for work, any work. And the gym on Halsted Street had a hand-lettered sign taped to the window that read "Help Wanted." Evenings only. Inside, the air smelled of sweat and rubber and old leather, and the sound of jump ropes slapping the floor mixed with the low thud of gloves against heavy bags. Abigail stood near the entrance for a long moment before a man built like a doorframe noticed her and asked what she wanted. She explained, quietly, that she was hoping to speak to whoever managed the place about the cleaning and evening assistant position. Her voice was steady, but her hands, folded in front of her, betrayed the kind of exhaustion that came from counting bills late at night and finding the number, always a little short. She had a daughter waiting at home with a neighbor who could only watch her for another hour, and Abigail had rehearsed this conversation twice in the mirror before leaving her apartment, wanting to sound capable rather than desperate. Logan Hayes, the owner of the gym, came out from the back office, wiping his hands on a towel, and looked her over with the practical eye of a man who had hired dozens of people over the years. He liked that she had shown up in person instead of calling. He liked that she looked him in the eye. He was already half inclined to give her a trial shift when a voice cut across the gym floor, sharp and amused, belonging to a man who clearly believed the room belonged to him. Mason Reed was the head trainer, and everyone in that gym knew it because he made sure they did. He was handsome in the way that photographed well, with a jaw made for magazine covers and a reputation built on 3 regional titles and a talent for talking louder than anyone who might have quietly outworked him. He crossed the floor with his arms loose at his sides, looking at Abigail the way a man looks at something he has already decided is beneath his attention. He asked Logan, without lowering his voice, whether they were now hiring people off the street who looked like they had wandered in by mistake. He said it with a smile, the kind that let him deny cruelty later if anyone accused him of it. Abigail did not flinch, though a few of the fighters near the ring had already stopped what they were doing to watch. She had learned a long time ago that stillness cost her nothing and gave her enemies nothing to work with either. Logan tried to wave Mason off, telling him this was not his decision to make, that the gym needed extra hands in the evenings and Abigail seemed reliable. But Mason was not finished. He said the gym had an image to protect sponsors who dropped by unannounced, and he did not think a tired single mother mopping floors between rounds was the kind of image that brought in money. He said the word mother the way some men say weakness, as though the two were interchangeable, and something in Abigail's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She did not argue with him. She simply repeated calmly that she needed the job and was willing to work hard for it, that she would take whatever hours nobody else wanted. Logan, caught between the practical need for staff and Mason's outsized influence over the gym's sponsors and reputation, hesitated. Mason saw the hesitation and pressed his advantage the way he always did, sensing an opportunity to remind everyone in the building exactly who held the real power here, regardless of whose name was on the lease. Mason decided to turn the moment into a spectacle rather than let it end quietly. He walked to the equipment rack, picked up a pair of scarred old gloves that had not seen a real match in years, and dropped them at Abigail's feet with a small theatrical flourish. He announced, loud enough for the whole gym to hear, that if she could survive one easy round with him, she could have the job, and if she could not, she should save everyone the trouble and go home. A ripple of laughter moved through the fighters gathered near the ring, some of them already pulling out their phones, sensing entertainment. Abigail looked down at the gloves and then back up at Mason, and for the first time since walking in, something flickered behind her eyes that had nothing to do with fatigue. She told him, evenly, that she was not interested in fighting anyone, that she had only come for work. Mason took this as confirmation of everything he had already assumed about her, and he kept pushing, telling the room that he had known it, that some people talked about strength but folded the moment anyone asked them to prove it. He kept going, unwilling to let it drop, and his words began to sharpen into something crueler than casual mockery. He told her that a single mother had no business pretending she belonged in a serious fighter's gym, that she should go home to her kid and stop wasting everyone's time playing at toughness. The room had gone quieter now, the kind of quiet that comes when people sense a line has been crossed, but nobody wants to be the one to say so out loud. That particular remark landed somewhere deep in Abigail, in a place she had spent years trying to seal shut. Being a mother was not her weakness. It was the reason she got up every single morning, the reason she had walked away from a life she once knew and never looked back. And hearing Mason twist it into an insult did something to her that his laughter alone never could have managed. She did not raise her voice. She did not argue. She simply bent down, picked up the gloves, and began lacing them with the calm, practiced movements of someone whose hands remembered a rhythm her mind had tried hard to forget. She pulled her hair back into a tight knot at the base of her neck, the same way she had done it 1,000 times before in a different life, in a different gym, under different lights. Logan watched her do it and felt something shift in his stomach, an instinct he could not name yet but did not like. There was a precision in the gesture, an economy of motion that had nothing to do with nervousness or bravado, and it did not match the picture Mason had painted of her at all. Abigail stepped through the ropes and into the ring, and the fighters who had been laughing moments earlier fell into an uneasy silence, watching her settle into a stance that seemed almost too natural for someone Mason had just called weak. Logan found himself moving closer to the ring apron without quite deciding to, some old instinct telling him that whatever was about to happen was not going to look anything like the joke Mason thought he was setting up. Mason entered the ring grinning at his own audience, throwing a few loose, showy jabs toward Abigail that were meant to humiliate rather than harm, the kind of strikes designed to make a person flinch and stumble for the amusement of onlookers. Abigail did not flinch. She moved her head half an inch to the side, let his glove pass harmlessly by her jaw, and reset her feet without a single wasted motion. The laughter around the ring began to thin out, replaced by a murmur of confusion. As if the crowd had expected a different kind of scene entirely, he tried again, a little harder this time, testing her, and again she slipped the punch with an ease that looked almost bored. Something about her stillness began to unsettle him more than any counterattack could have. He had built his whole identity in that gym on being untouchable, on being the fastest hands in the room. And here was a woman he had just called weak in front of everyone, moving like his punches were nothing more than a light breeze passing through. The gym had gone almost completely silent now. Even the fighters who had been recording on their phones lowered them slightly, sensing that whatever they were capturing was no longer the joke they had expected to post later. Mason's jaw tightened, his pride stinging in a way his fists had not yet managed to translate into results, and the showman in him gave way to something rawer and angrier. He stopped playing. His next punch came fast and full, aimed to actually land, to finally put the doubting whispers to rest and remind the room exactly who was in charge. Abigail read it the instant his shoulder shifted, the way she had read 1,000 punches before in another lifetime, and she rotated her hips in a single fluid motion that brought her whole body behind one clean, short counter. Her fist connected with his jaw with a sound that seemed to echo off the concrete walls. Mason's legs went first, folding beneath him before the rest of his body understood what had happened, and he dropped to the canvas in a heap, unconscious for several long seconds while the entire gym stood frozen. Nobody laughed. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the soft creak of the ropes settling and someone's phone clattering to the floor. Forgotten. Logan stood at the edge of the ring with his mouth slightly open, staring at Abigail as she lowered her hands and stepped back, breathing evenly, showing no trace of triumph or adrenaline, only a kind of tired resignation, as though this were a door she had hoped never to open again. He had trained fighters for over 20 years and had never seen anyone move quite like that, with that particular economy of violence that only comes from someone who has done this at a level far beyond anything his gym had ever produced. A young fighter near the ropes finally broke the silence, asking under his breath if anyone had actually seen what just happened, because it looked less like a lucky punch and more like something rehearsed 1,000 times in a life none of them knew anything about. Nobody answered him. Abigail climbed out of the ring without a word, unlaced the borrowed gloves, and set them carefully back on the rack, as if returning something she had only ever meant to borrow for a moment and now wanted no further part of. Logan watched her hands, steady and unhurried, and felt certain that whatever story stood behind this woman, it was far larger than the small, tired figure who had walked through his door asking to mop floors. Word of what had happened traveled through the gym faster than Mason regained consciousness. By the time he sat up, dazed and rubbing his jaw, half the building already knew, and by the end of the day, the story had spread to 2 other gyms across the city. Most people repeated it as a joke at first, a punchline about the loudmouth coach finally meeting someone he underestimated. But one man, an older trainer named Walter who had been around professional boxing for 3 decades, watched a shaky video someone had recorded and went very quiet. Walter approached Logan later that evening, his expression troubled, and told him that the way Abigail had turned her hips before that punch was not something people picked up in a weekend self-defense class. He said it reminded him of a fighter he had watched compete years earlier, a young woman with a similar build and the same distinctive habit of tucking her chin at the exact same angle before throwing a cross. He could not remember her name, only that she had disappeared from the sport suddenly, without explanation, at the height of a promising career. That evening, as Abigail walked home in the cold, her sister Evelyn was waiting outside her apartment building, arms crossed, clearly having already heard some version of the story through the same rapid gossip that moved through every gym in the city. Evelyn did not look happy. She asked Abigail, without any preamble, what exactly she thought she was doing, putting herself back in a ring after everything that had happened, after everything they had both worked so hard to leave behind them. Abigail tried to explain that she had not meant for any of it to happen, that she had only wanted a job, that Mason had pushed her past a point she could not walk back from once he brought her daughter into it. Evelyn's frustration eased slightly at that, softened by understanding, but her fear did not disappear. She reminded Abigail in a lowered voice that people did not forget faces in that world, that someone eventually would recognize the way she moved, exactly the way Walter already had. Through their conversation, pieces of the past began to surface for anyone listening closely, though neither sister said everything out loud. Abigail had once been a serious contender for a national title, a fighter whose name had circulated in serious conversations about who might rise to the top of her division. She had walked away after a fight that had been quietly manipulated behind the scenes, a fight that left her opponent with injuries far worse than anyone anticipated, injuries that were never supposed to happen under fair conditions. Mason, though nobody in the gym knew it yet, had been connected to that same fight years earlier, in a role nobody had ever properly investigated. Abigail had spent years building a quiet, invisible life specifically so she would never have to stand near that world again, let alone find herself back inside a ring with cameras watching. She told Evelyn she had no interest in revenge, that she only wanted to raise her daughter in peace and never speak of any of it again. But somewhere across the city, Mason Reed had begun to feel, for the first time in years, a very particular kind of fear. He sat alone in his apartment that night, replaying the moment in his mind. Not the punch itself, but the calm on Abigail's face right before it landed. A calm he now recognized from somewhere deep in his own memory, though he refused to let the thought fully form. He told himself it meant nothing, that plenty of people could throw a decent punch under the right circumstances, and that his reputation would recover the moment people found something else to talk about. Still, a small, persistent unease settled into his chest and refused to leave, the kind of feeling a man gets when a door he thought he had locked years ago quietly begins open again. By the time Mason returned to the gym the next morning, his jaw had swollen into a dull purple but the wound to his pride ran far deeper than anything visible. He walked in already rehearsing a version of events where he had been caught off guard by an unfair, underhanded strike, and he began repeating that version to anyone who would listen, insisting that Abigail had sucker punched him while he was not properly braced, that no real fighter would call what happened a fair contest. He used every connection he had built over the years in the local boxing community, calling old contacts and reporters he had cultivated relationships with, framing Abigail as an unstable, dangerous woman who had attacked him without provocation inside a gym meant for serious training. Rumors began spreading through group chats and local sports forums, twisted further with each retelling, until the story bore almost no resemblance to what had actually happened in that ring. He confronted Logan directly, demanding that Abigail be fired immediately, reminding him bluntly that Mason's name was the reason sponsors kept the gym's doors open, that without his classes and his reputation, half the building's income would disappear within a month. Logan found himself trapped between two truths he could not easily reconcile: a genuine unease about what Mason represented and a very real financial dependence on the very man, causing him that unease. Logan reluctantly agreed to let Abigail go, telling himself it was a temporary decision made under pressure rather than a real reflection of what he believed was right. Abigail accepted the news quietly when he delivered it, without argument, gathering her things with the same steady composure she had carried since the day she first walked through the door. She told him she understood, that she had never expected this to end any other way once Mason decided to make it personal. Before she could leave, however, a commotion broke out near the back of the gym. A teenage fighter named Carter, one of Mason's own students, had collapsed mid-drill after being pushed through an exhausting session meant to prove a point to the rest of the class following the incident with Abigail. Mason stood frozen, unsure what to do, while the boy's breathing turned shallow and irregular on the mat. Abigail moved before anyone else could react, kneeling beside the teenager, checking his airway, elevating his legs and speaking to him in a calm, low voice until his breathing steadied enough for the paramedics to take over safely. When they arrived minutes later, the fighters who had gathered around watched in stunned silence, seeing for the first time not the woman Mason had described in his stories, but someone who clearly knew exactly what she was doing, someone whose competence had nothing to do with luck. Logan watched the entire scene unfold and felt something inside him shift permanently. Whatever story Mason had been selling about Abigail no longer matched what stood plainly in front of him, and for the first time since this had all started, he began to seriously question whether he had made the right decision letting her walk away. He caught up with her at the door before she left, thanking her quietly for what she had done, and admitting in a voice lower than his usual gruff tone that he had judged the situation badly. Abigail told him there was nothing to apologize for, that she understood the position he had been in, and that she held no anger toward him personally. Still, as she stepped out into the cold afternoon air, she carried with her the uneasy sense that Mason would not simply let the matter rest here, that a man that afraid of losing his image rarely stopped at one small act of damage control. A few nights later, Evelyn showed up at Abigail's apartment carrying an old shoebox she had kept hidden in her closet for years, the kind of box people fill with things they cannot bring themselves to throw away or look at often. Inside, wrapped carefully in a cloth, sat a small flash drive that Evelyn had held onto since the night everything fell apart, a piece of evidence neither of them had ever found the courage to use. Evelyn explained, her voice unsteady, that the drive contained footage from a security camera positioned near the equipment room on the night of Abigail's final fight all those years ago. Footage that showed exactly what had happened to her gloves before she ever stepped into the ring. Abigail sat very still as her sister spoke, old memories rising to the surface faster than she could push them back down. They watched the footage together on an old laptop, the grainy black and white image showing two figures switching out a set of gloves for a different pair moments before the fight. Gloves that had been tampered with in a way that made every punch land with far more force than regulation allowed. One of the figures, though the footage was imperfect, moved with a build and posture that both sisters recognized instantly. It was Mason, younger, thinner, but unmistakably him, working alongside a sponsor who had long since disappeared from the sport entirely. Abigail's opponent that night had suffered injuries that ended her career permanently, and Abigail had been blamed publicly for excessive force in the ring, her reputation destroyed within days despite having no idea her gloves had ever been altered. She had stayed silent afterward, not out of guilt, but out of fear, after receiving a quiet, chilling warning that speaking up would cost her custody of her daughter and every job she might ever hope to hold in the industry again. She had chosen her daughter over her own name, walking away from boxing entirely and building a small, careful life far from anyone who might recognize her, never imagining she would end up standing in a ring again a decade later, facing the very man who had helped destroy everything she once was, Logan. Unaware of the full history but sensing there was more beneath the surface than anyone had told him, had quietly obtained a copy of the gym's camera footage from the night of the confrontation and reviewed it on his own that same week. What he saw only deepened his suspicion that Mason's version of events did not match reality, though he still lacked the full picture Abigail and Evelyn now held in their hands. As it happened, the gym was preparing to host a charity exhibition event within the month, an evening meant to raise money for local youth boxing programs, and Mason had already positioned himself as the guest of honor, eager to use the spotlight to repair the damage done to his reputation. Abigail now faced an impossible choice, whether to remain silent and let the past stay buried, or to finally step forward and risk everything to set the record straight once and for all. That night, after Evelyn had gone home, Abigail sat alone at her kitchen table with the flash drive in front of her, turning it over in her fingers as her daughter slept in the next room. She thought about the years she had spent building an ordinary life, the quiet satisfaction of school pickups and grocery runs and evenings with nothing more dramatic to worry about than an overdue bill. She thought too about the version of herself who had once dreamed of a national title, a version she had folded away and told herself she no longer needed. For the first time in a decade, she allowed herself to wonder whether staying silent had ever truly been peace, or whether it had only ever been a way of surviving a fear she had never gotten the chance to face head on. Mason, desperate to rebuild the image the last few weeks had cracked, decided the charity exhibition offered the perfect stage for his comeback. He announced publicly, through a local sports reporter eager for a story, that he would offer Abigail a formal exhibition match at the event, framing it as a generous gesture toward a troubled woman who deserved a proper chance to prove herself under fair conditions. He believed, with the same misplaced confidence that had gotten him this far, that beating her clearly in front of cameras and a paying audience would erase every whisper circulating about their first encounter. Abigail refused the moment she heard about it secondhand, telling Evelyn flatly that she had no intention of ever stepping into a ring again for anyone's entertainment, least of all Mason's. She had spent years walking away from that world, and she was not interested in giving it back the power to define her life a second time. But Mason, unwilling to accept refusal as an answer, escalated his campaign through every avenue available to him. He gave interviews suggesting that Abigail was simply afraid, that she had gotten lucky once and knew a real contest would expose her for exactly what he claimed. She was an amateur who had thrown one desperate punch and disappeared before anyone could ask questions. The narrative spread quickly among people who had never met either of them, and Abigail found herself the subject of conversations happening in gyms and group chats across the city without ever having spoken a single public word herself. Logan, watching all of this unfold, finally found the courage to visit Abigail directly rather than leaving her to face it alone. He told her plainly that he understood her reluctance, that nobody had the right to demand she relive the worst chapter of her life for anyone's entertainment. But he also gently suggested that silence, however peaceful it might feel in the moment, sometimes allowed people like Mason to keep hurting others long after they should have been stopped. His words settled uncomfortably close to something Abigail had already been turning over in her own mind since the night she watched that old footage with Evelyn. She thought of the teenage fighter who had collapsed under Mason's reckless training, of the other young athletes still cycling through his classes, exposed to the same ego and carelessness that had once cost her everything. Staying invisible had protected her for years, but it had also left Mason free to keep repeating the same patterns on people with far less power than she now quietly possessed. After several days of careful thought, Abigail agreed to the exhibition match, but only on her own terms. She insisted that the fight be officially sanctioned, recorded from multiple angles, and overseen by an independent panel with no ties to either the gym or Mason's sponsors. Mason, eager to secure the fight before she could change her mind, agreed to every condition without hesitation, already quietly planning behind the scenes exactly how he intended to make certain history did not repeat itself in his opponent's favor this time. He reached out to the same sponsor connections that had helped him years earlier, careful this time to keep every conversation vague enough to deny later if pressed, testing whether anyone still owed him a favor large enough to guarantee an outcome. Most declined outright, unwilling to risk their names on something so publicly watched, but one old associate, eager to protect a partnership with Mason's gym, agreed to help arrange something small and difficult to trace, a slight adjustment to the wrapping process that would go unnoticed by anyone not looking for it. Mason told himself this was simply insurance, a way of guaranteeing the story ended the way it always should have, with him standing and everyone else forgetting they had ever doubted him at all. The night of the charity exhibition arrived with the gym transformed almost beyond recognition, folding chairs arranged in tight rows around a portable ring, local news cameras set up near the entrance, and sponsors mingling near a small stage decorated with banners for the youth boxing program event was meant to support. Every seat filled quickly, drawn by weeks of rumor and Mason's carefully cultivated narrative promising a decisive, satisfying end to the whole affair. Mason walked out first to enthusiastic applause, waving to the crowd with the easy confidence of a man who had already decided how the night would end. He treated the moment less like an exhibition and more like a public execution of any remaining doubt about his standing, smiling for cameras and shaking hands along the front row as though he had already won something significant before the first bell had even rung. Abigail entered without any of the same fanfare, dressed simply, her expression calm and unreadable as she made her way toward the ring. She did not look at the cameras or acknowledge the murmurs rippling through the crowd. Her focus stayed entirely on her breathing, slow and even, the same discipline that had carried her through every difficult moment of her old career, resurfacing now with quiet familiarity. The first round began with Mason immediately testing the boundaries of fair play, throwing a low blow disguised within a combination, hoping to rattle her early and set the tone before the judges could properly react. Abigail absorbed it without complaint, choosing not to escalate, focusing instead on defense and careful observation rather than retaliation, watching Mason's footwork for the same subtle tell she remembered from years earlier. Near the edge of the ring, Logan noticed something unusual happening at Mason's corner between rounds, his assistant handling the wraps with more attention than a routine adjustment usually required. Glancing around nervously as he worked, Logan's instincts, sharpened by everything he had learned over the past weeks, told him this deserved closer attention, and he quietly signaled one of the independent officials to keep an eye on the corner. At the same moment, Evelyn made her way through the crowd toward the official's table, the flash drive from years earlier held carefully in her hand, having decided the time for silence had finally run out. She spoke briefly and urgently with the head of the independent panel, explaining what the footage showed and why it mattered now more than ever. The official's expression shifted from polite confusion to genuine alarm as pieces of the story began falling into place. Word of what Evelyn had brought forward began moving quietly through the officials and event organizers gathered near the ring, though Mason, caught up in his own performance under the bright lights, remained completely unaware that the ground beneath his comeback had already begun to shift. The second round opened with the crowd growing louder, sensing that something in the atmosphere had changed, even if they could not name what it was. Officials near the scoring table exchanged glances they usually reserved for moments requiring intervention, and one of them slipped away briefly to review the footage Evelyn had provided on a small tablet, screen shielded from the audience's view. Mason continued fighting as though nothing had changed, throwing combinations meant to wear Abigail down and end the match decisively before the final bell, still entirely convinced that whatever whispers were moving through the crowd had nothing to do with him. As the rounds wore on, Mason's frustration began to show through cracks in his usual composure. Every clean shot he expected to land was slipping past Abigail's guard or landing without the effect he anticipated, and the crowd, once cheering enthusiastically for him, had grown noticeably quieter, watching instead with the tense curiosity of people who sensed the story unfolding in front of them no longer matched the script they had been promised. He began swinging wider, more recklessly, his technique fraying under the weight of a growing panic he refused to acknowledge even to himself. Abigail, sensing the shift in his rhythm, allowed herself to finally step forward instead of merely reacting. Her counters came cleaner now, controlled and precise, each one landing with the discipline of someone who had trained for years under far more demanding conditions than anything this exhibition required. There was no anger in her movements, no desire to humiliate him the way he had once tried to humiliate her. She fought the way she always had, with quiet, exacting purpose. In the final round, Mason threw a wild, dangerous hook aimed to end the match decisively, abandoning caution entirely in his desperation to reclaim control of the narrative before it slipped away from him completely. Abigail saw it coming from the same shift in his shoulder she had read a decade earlier, slipped beneath it smoothly, and answered with a single clean punch to his jaw, almost identical to the one that had started this entire chapter of both their lives. Mason dropped to the canvas in front of the same crowd that had come expecting to watch her. Humiliation, and this time nobody in the room mistook it for luck. The silence that followed was heavier than the first time, filled now with the growing awareness that something larger than a boxing match had just concluded in that ring. Before Mason had even fully regained his senses, the head of the independent panel stepped forward with a microphone. Addressing the stunned crowd directly, she explained calmly and clearly that new evidence had come to light confirming that Mason Reed had been involved in tampering with equipment during a sanctioned match years earlier, evidence that directly implicated him in ending another fighter's career under fraudulent circumstances. The crowd's murmurs turned to gasps, then to a low, disbelieving hush. Mason's sponsors, several of whom sat in the front rows that evening, began quietly gathering their things and leaving before the panel had even finished speaking, unwilling to have their names associated any further with what was unfolding. Within days, Mason would be formally suspended from any involvement with sanctioned boxing events, his name pulled from every remaining commitment he had scheduled for the coming year. Abigail did not celebrate. She stood at the center of the ring, breathing steadily, and told the small cluster of reporters who approached her afterward that she had not returned to boxing to seek revenge against anyone. She said simply that she had come back to reclaim a name that had been taken from her unfairly. Nothing more and nothing less. And then she stepped down from the ring and walked toward her sister, who was waiting for her with tears already falling. Evelyn wrapped her arms around Abigail without a word, and for a long moment neither sister said anything at all, the noise of the dispersing crowd fading into the background as they stood together near the edge of the ring. Logan approached a few minutes later, quieter than usual, and simply thanked her for what she had done, admitting that he wished he had trusted his own instincts about Mason far sooner than he had. Abigail told him it was over now, that whatever came next mattered far more than anything that had already happened, and for the first time in years she felt the strange, unfamiliar lightness of a burden she had carried for far too long finally beginning to lift. In the weeks that followed, Logan made the decision to formally cut all ties with Mason, removing his name from the gym's schedule and his photographs from the walls where they had hung for years, celebrating a version of the man that no longer had any place in the building. He sought Abigail out personally, sitting across from her in the small office at the back of the gym, and apologized directly for how easily he had allowed Mason's arrogance to dictate decisions that should never have been his to make in the first place. Abigail accepted the apology graciously, telling him that everyone in that room had been operating under assumptions built by a man who had spent years crafting exactly the image he wanted people to believe. She did not hold on to bitterness toward Logan, understanding the difficult position he had been placed in, caught between financial necessity and a truth he had not yet fully seen. Logan then offered her something she had not expected, a permanent position at the gym, not as a cleaner or evening assistant, but as a technical trainer, someone who could teach both skill and integrity to a new generation of fighters coming through the doors. He told her plainly that the gym needed someone who understood what real discipline looked like, someone whose presence alone could remind everyone what the sport was supposed to represent before ego and shortcuts corrupted it. Abigail considered the offer carefully before accepting, aware that stepping back into this world meant more than simply teaching footwork and combinations. She began building a program specifically designed for people the sport usually overlooked: beginners nervous about their first class, older adults returning to fitness after years away, and young people who needed somewhere safe to rebuild confidence that life had chipped away at them elsewhere. She called it nothing fancy, simply naming it the fundamentals class, though within weeks it had become the most requested session on the gym's schedule. Evelyn watched her sister step into this new role with a quiet pride she had not felt in a long time, relieved beyond words to see Abigail finally released from the weight she had silently carried since that night so many years earlier. For the first time since everything fell apart, Evelyn no longer worried every time her sister left the apartment, no longer flinched at the mention of boxing, no longer feared that the past might reach forward and pull Abigail back under. Several of the fighters who had laughed loudest on that very first day, the ones who had raised their phones expecting an easy joke at her expense, eventually approached Abigail individually to apologize. One young man named Carter, the same fighter she had helped when he collapsed during Mason's reckless training session, told her he was ashamed of how he had behaved that first afternoon, admitting he had judged her before ever giving her the chance to prove otherwise. Abigail did not dwell on the old humiliation or ask any of them to relive it further. Instead, she used those conversations as an opportunity to set a new standard for how the gym would operate. Going forward, telling each of them plainly that respect for other people came before technique, that a fighter who could not treat someone with basic decency outside the ring had no business claiming discipline inside it. Slowly, the culture of the gym began to shift quietly but unmistakably, away from the arrogance Mason had cultivated and toward something steadier and more grounded. Mason himself disappeared from the boxing world almost entirely after his suspension, his name mentioned occasionally in passing conversations but never with the reverence it once commanded. He moved out of the city within a few months. Unwilling to remain somewhere, every corner reminded him of the reputation he had spent years building and lost in the span of a single evening. Nobody at the gym spoke of him with anger anymore, only with the quiet understanding that his downfall had been built entirely by his own choices, brick by brick, long before Abigail ever walked through that door. On a quiet morning several months later, before the gym opened for the day and the first students arrived, Abigail let herself in early, flipped on just enough lights to see clearly, and stepped into the empty ring alone. She stood at its center for a long moment, feeling the familiar texture of the canvas beneath her shoes, the stillness of a room that had once represented everything she feared and now represented something closer to home. She was not running from anything anymore. She was not hiding, and she was not performing for anyone watching. She thought of her daughter, asleep at home, growing up in a house where her mother no longer carried the weight of a secret too heavy to name. She thought of Evelyn, finally able to breathe without watching for danger around every corner. She thought, too, of the version of herself who had once walked away from this sport in silence. And she understood now that coming back had never really been about proving anything to Mason or to anyone who had doubted her. Real strength, she had come to understand, was never about knocking someone else down. It was about standing back up after the entire world had once tried to bury you, and choosing, quietly and deliberately, to keep moving forward anyway. As the first light of morning spread slowly across the empty gym floor, Abigail Carter stood alone in the center of the ring, steady, unafraid, and finally, completely at peace. If you love stories about earned redemption and the quiet cost of dignity, stay with us until the very last word.